So in um, data scarce systems like agroecology, expert knowledge elicitation is often our primary source of information about parameters, relationships, uncertainty. We use it for, or can be used for, quantifying judgment. And the question is really how to use it in a rigorous way. So we should be careful about selecting experts. Who do we talk to? Who do we include? And make sure that that's diverse, et cetera. Kahneman and other behavioral economists have warned us, of course, made us very aware, at least, of the systematic bias in human judgment related to overconfidence, anchoring, and availability. I've put the codex here, removed all the labels, but there are many cognitive biases that drive this black box. Really operate this black box operates on these many biases. And given this awareness, we have to have a rigorous method for using expert knowledge. And there are many protocols that have been identified in an attempt to discipline the process, not eliminating bias, but managing it in a transparent way. Work by Cook and others have introduced structured processes, including weighting and aggregation. And the typical general approach or the general purpose of this is to come up with some distributions, quantifying judgment that's more robust than any single opinion. The risk, as you're seeing here on the slide, is the garbage in, gospel out risk, which is just to say that the process is extremely sensitive to framing, facilitation, and expert selection. But if it's done well, if it's done in a rigorous way and transparently, then it can give us the raw materials. And the next question is how to structure them into coherent causal models. So we can use those raw materials for a causal story about how complex systems are believed to interact. Here I've drawn a simple collection of nodes and edges, or circles and arrows. And just to make causal assumptions explicit, we can use causal models. We build this causality map. We can use causal models. These are often Bayesian to structure our assumptions. And we can use stochastic simulation, often Monte Carlo simulation, to propagate uncertainty conditional on the assumptions. These are complementary, Bayes and Monte Carlo, complementary in that they answer different questions. Bayes makes our causal commitments explicit, and Monte Carlo simulations can explore the consequences of being wrong. So we'll walk through that together. This is a deliberately minimal causal map of our value chains problem. So it implies this specific probabilistic structure. Price stability is conditionally dependent on producer risk and trust, and governance and climate shocks matter, but indirectly through their effect on risk. The point is to make our assumptions explicit. And the dashed alternative arrow there is just to indicate that trust may lead to price stability, or maybe that price stability trust is rather an effect of price stability and it's not directly driving it. Both stories are plausible, and that ambiguity matters for choosing our interventions. So once our causal assumptions are written down, a central limitation is identifiability. We've got these two minimal causal models. They share the same variables. The only difference is just that single arrow. So I've split that into two now. And these two directed graphs are not statistically distinguishable with available data. That is to say, but they do recommend different investments, different scales, and different risk tolerances. They're both plausible. And from the perspective of conditional interdependencies, they're observationally equivalent, to steal a term from Judea-Pearl. It is, in fact, a textbook identifiability problem, but it has real consequences for agroecological decisions. In an ideal world, every arrow in our causal maps would be informed by RCTs or longitudinal studies, but in practice, we often rely on incomplete data. And no amount of observational data could necessarily distinguish between them. We could have information about prices to update our price stability part of our model. We could have participation rates all along the value chain and see if that indicates anything about trust. We could have yield variability to indicate climate shocks and producer risks. And we could have entry and exit events, also people dropping in out of our schemes, or entering our schemes to indicate this level of trust, but none of these would necessarily settle the argument. We could have both of these causal stories fit the same observational associations. They could remain compatible with what we observe, and it wouldn't necessarily settle the argument. So the question becomes, how fragile are decisions under each of these plausible stories? I'm not arguing that we can always eliminate omitted variables, but I'm asking what responsible decision making looks like when we can't. That's what's interesting here. So um, let's talk now about causal stress testing with Monte Carlo simulations. We need our input uncertainties in order to make this possible. So weather variability, et cetera, could be entered into our causal model. We need a causal model structure as a step, and we can use this to explore how fragile outcomes are under uncertainty and shock, and indicate how badly decisions fail if our causal story is wrong. The Monte Carlo simulation allows us to propagate the uncertainty forward and generate a distribution of possible futures. And at this point, an implicit choice often appears. Given our uncertainty, we can see, depending on what we care about, optimizing average outcomes, minimizing downside risks, or preserving relational stability, that trust that we talked about. But what we're interested in here is how systems fail across these plausible futures under shocks. And it's a way to ask, what breaks if our causal story is wrong? So we may put our attention on this vulnerability and tail risk, low probability, high impact outcomes, and really concentrate there and say, well, these are just unacceptable. Losing the farm or destroying the ecology or losing value chains, this part of our value chain is unacceptable. And we can understand where the unacceptable failure takes place. And values, of course, enter implicitly throughout the process, but here, when we identify what's unacceptable, that's another point. Most risk frameworks assume the right to fail, but agroecological interventions often do not have that luxury. So to explore how decisions change under causal ambiguity, here's a simple simulated model. We're looking at the gain and net benefit here as a distribution from the two models that we've discussed, our competing causal stories. And these are parameterized from the agri-food value chain literature. You can see there on the slide. So we can use these to think about trade-off to program scale as an example of downside risk. And these are the frontiers under these competing causal models. So X here indicates how far our program coverage goes. So we go to more cooperatives, greater area. And the Y is the probability of loss to farmer. And that causing an exit either from the value chain or from farming, but the big L is massive loss to unbearable loss to the farmer. And that's the probability of this happening. So each point on our, because this is based on a Monte Carlo simulation, each point here is a complete irreversible program design. And the decision relevant question here in determining this, the difference between these frontiers, or our position in the differences between these frontiers, is if we knew the correct causal story, would this move us to a different part of the frontier? If we knew that one was better than the other, or one was more true than the other, would we end up in a different position? We would. If we knew that price drives trust, then we would prefer to be in that world. Earlier, I showed value of information as it's usually presented, assuming we know what kind of uncertainty we're reducing. But now we can ask a different question. Is resolving causal ambiguity actually worth doing so for this decision? So our current ambiguity, we could act now and have our outcome under current uncertainty. So run the model for this, and it's really just the difference between these two worlds, the 50-50 expectation. We have a 50-50 chance of being right because we give equal likelihood to these two causal stories. And so we get a distribution which is right in between the two of those. And if we do our research first, we get expected value of the minus, that expected value minus the cost of research and weighting. These are, by the way, 4,000 model runs. I just ran it a few times. So we get our expected value after doing our research. And we can see that's right around 0. We don't get a whole lot with the rather positive tail there. And if so the value of information is the difference between these, of course, and it's mainly negative. That is to say, it's not really worth resolving. If resolving trust driving price or price driving trust changes the optimal decision only 2% of the time, VUI is small, and it tells us to stop arguing and act. But the idea here is really to apply value of information for deciding which uncertainties are worth carrying forward when optimization is impossible. So the toolkit in practice is just a small example of how to apply this, but the toolkit in practice, it's explicit, it's fragile, and it's conditional. Uncertainty enters through expert elicitation and expert judgment. And we need to indicate what we think we know here. Bayesian networks force us to make causal assumptions explicit, so we have to define these causal mechanisms. Monte Carlo simulations can allow us to ask what follows if assumptions are competing. So how does uncertainty propagate and what follows if we're wrong? And value of information disciplines the whole process by asking which uncertainties are actually worth reducing. Which ones matter for action, and what should we learn next? Or should we even be willing to learn now? Tools don't overcome complexity, they help reason with it and clarify assumptions and consequences.